Thank you very much, Rob. We good? Yep. Okay. So yes, g'day everyone, and thanks for coming along. As Rob mentioned, I'm David Meacock. I'm an engineering director at Qoria, and I'm here to talk to you today about engineering experience. And if you're sitting there thinking, just what on earth is EX? Well, good, you're at the right talk. Before I begin, I want to start by acknowledging the sponsors, without whom DDD doesn't happen. I also want to give a massive shout out to the volunteers who just year after year come along and set this thing up and create a wonderful, wonderful conference for the rest of the Perth community. If they don't come along, this doesn't happen, so amazing job by them again. I also want to give a bit of a shout out to my employer Qoria. Obviously, a lot of my talk today wouldn't exist without them giving me the opportunity to go ahead and do this role. I've been working for them for about 6 years now. It's been fantastic to work for an amazing cause, and it's something that just has enabled me to grow and play a variety of roles and explore things that I wouldn't have been able to do previously. We are at a sponsor at DDD today. You can come and see us at our booth in the Sports Lounge. So, what is the engineering experience? To begin here, let's start with some background. So, growth brings massive opportunities to any organization. In 2021, I saw a talk from Mike Noonan of Octopus Deploy at YOW Conference. And he was talking about scaling Octopus Deploy, not the technology, but the organization. And he described it as a lot like riding a tiger. It's something that you've got to just grip onto, hold on tight, and just hope it goes well as you go along. And having lived that experience over 6 years at Qoria, I can absolutely see what he was talking about. When I joined, we were about 30-something people based in a small office here in Perth. We're now like, 400, 500 people all around the world 6 years later. And what it means to work in a company like that changes a lot, both as a developer and a company member. For us, scale meant a rapid growth that risked a Frankenstein of culture, practice, tooling, platforms. We never really set out to be a multi-cloud company, but through acquisitions, we ended up with all three of them, so that happened. You get increasing expectations from customers and investors. People look at a startup very differently as they look at a company that now has to win market share and compete. And you get increasing expectations from internal staff and potential new joiners as well. If you're joining a startup, you wear lots of hats. You don't always get, all the trimmings and stuff that come with a larger organization. Once you reach a certain size, that becomes a base expectation. So having felt a number of the pain points that come along this way, and increasingly wanting to solve problems of alignment that were going across the whole department and organization, I had the idea of pitching to my CTO a new kind of role, specifically looking at solving some of these big picture problems. Luckily for me, he had the equally crazy idea of accepting that. And so in our first chat about the role, we sat down and we thought, what were the things that we wanted to achieve? And the main three things that we identified at the start were wanting to engage and empower our people. So we wanted to create an environment that drove retention for engineers, but also enabled them to do their best work. Doing this meant driving learning and development within the organization. We were constantly having to learn new skills, new platforms as our technologies changed, or you moved from platform A to platform B, and you need to invest a lot in your people in order to achieve that. Finally, we wanted to boost productivity, because at the end of the day, you don't improve your teams without wanting to see an improvement of output, removing friction, removing roadblocks, making teams happier. At the end of the day, happier teams are more productive teams. So, naming is hard. It's like the saying goes, there are two hard problems in computer science: location validation, naming, and off-by-one errors. There seem to be a lot of overloaded terms in our industry. Throughout this talk, you're going to hear terms and titles like this a lot. And indeed, there are going to be people walking around at the conference today with titles like, developer experience team or developer productivity engineer. And That's great. There might even be some people with those titles in this room. There's nothing wrong with these titles. It just didn't really describe what I wanted to do in the role that I was about to create. This is a slide that I used to pitch the role internally to some of our leadership at Qoria. And what I was trying to do is trying to create a really holistic approach, looking at the end-to-end experience for our people. So I couldn't just focus on the tooling, even though as an engineer at heart, that's something that I'm really passionate about. And I couldn't just look at the work that they were being asked to do. I had to also look at what we might traditionally call softer things, the kind of environment that they're working in, the way that teams interact with each other, the goals that we're setting for our people within the organization, or their aspirations on the career ladder. To me, all these things make up part of your day-to-day work as an engineer, whether you realize them or not. And so I wanted to have a look at all of these things in the role of EX, and I wanted to do it for people that weren't just developers. Developers are really important, but I strongly believe that the base unit delivery in any organization is the team, and developers are only one part of that. So if you're only optimizing for one part of the chain, you're missing something. So another way of thinking about engineering experience is thinking about some of the problems that prevent it from being great. The developers in the room might be familiar with code smells. The idea that there are small little things in your code base that in isolation, they might not seem like the biggest problem in the world, but they're usually indicative of a much bigger issue. A suppressed exception here, a badly named function there, a method that's got 12 different parameters. Now, your experience as an engineer is no different. There are smells that exist that point to bigger problems within your organization. Now, if you look at this screen up here, who in this room has experienced one of these at some point in their career, or indeed something very similar? Right, so it's most of the room. Last week, sure. At the end of the day, your experience is important, and these are things that get in your way. Now, it's important to try and take stock and measure the experience that you've got. The question is, how do we do that? Measurement is hard. I'm really sad that I'm giving a talk at the same time as my former colleague Esty, who's got a great talk on metrics and their misuses. You should absolutely watch that back later on. I'll start with a quote by Martin Fowler, because I really like Martin Fowler, and this quote speaks to me. You cannot measure the productivity of software teams, but that doesn't mean that people don't try. Executives love a good metric, but before we pick on executives, so do engineers. We sit there and we look at P99s for API requests, we think about how long our system has been up or down, and we pick apart the little itty-bitty things about our sprints. There's always a temptation for people to take the latest thing that the internet is talking about and treat it as a silver bullet, a panacea for all your problems. Oh, how did that get there? DORA metrics are something that I want to talk about because for some time now, the DevOps Research and Assessment Group has been looking at software delivery performance within organizations. And they have 4 key metrics that they use to measure this. So they look at how often an organization successfully releases to production, how long it takes a commit to get from the code out to production, percentage of deployments that are causing a failure, and how long it takes an organization to recover from one of those failures. And these are all very sound and research-backed metrics. They also have a bucketing, a rating system, if you like. Now, this page is a bit old. It's lifted from a blog post in 2020. There's now only 3 buckets as opposed to 4. But essentially, you get the picture here. So you look at where your team or your organization sits on this table, and you get bucketed into either an elite performer, a high performer, a low performer, etc. It's really useful. Except, maybe DORA is unfair for you. Maybe you work in a regulated industry, or maybe your software goes into military hardware and you measure your release cadence in years, not days. Most of all, maybe you have to deal with Apple and their mystical release process that's driven by a magic 8-ball. At the end of the day, metrics like DORA are a really handy way of showing where overall things are at for your team and whether they're getting better or worse. But they absolutely have their limitations, and they fundamentally have their misuses. If you're seeing people taking raw DORA metrics for Team A and Team B and comparing them and saying that one of these teams is better or worse, that should be ringing some alarm bells. Don't take my word for it, though. So Dr. Nicole Forsgren, who is the DORA lead and the co-author of Accelerate, the science of lean software and DevOps, she says that the key is to measure, adjust your context if necessary, understand where you are, and then improve. Industry benchmarks be damned. Now, this is the person who wrote the book, the literal book about this stuff. Another quote I like from her is, while the metrics are a good starting point, it's beyond this that the real work begins. Where are our constraints, our blockers, our roadblocks? You can try and find this algorithmically if you build something to do this, or, she suggests, you can just ask people what they swear at the most often. And honestly, I like that idea. And that brings us to the space of developer productivity. This is also authored by Dr. Forsgren alongside Dr. Margaret Ann Story, and this is a really, really interesting paper. For people who don't read papers a lot, don't worry about it, it's pretty consumable, but it sets out 5 key dimensions of developer productivity: satisfaction and well-being, performance, activity, communication, collaboration, and efficiency and flow. The whole point of SPACE is that when looking at developer productivity, or in my eyes, engineering experience, we can't just look at the stuff that we're pulling from GitHub in terms of stats. We can't just look at our DORA metrics. That can tell you about performance, it can tell you about activity, but there's 3 whole dimensions there that's not reaching. This is a table pulled from the SPACE paper. It's not even the full table. There's stuff that goes off the screen and it just gets too small. But you can see from here just how many things there are to potentially look at to understand this space. The thing is, unfortunately, people looked at this table and they were like, right, these are all the things we need to measure within our organization, and we will understand and we'll be able to put a number on developer productivity. No, not really. It's kind of the point that it's making is that there's a lot and you can't really just simply draw things out with raw numbers. Again, quoting the author of the paper, Dr. Margaret Ann Story, it's not a quick fix. It can't be applied. It doesn't take away the hard work that you've got to do to understand what's going on with your company, within your software teams, between your engineering systems, and that takes a lot of work. And that brings me to developer productivity at Stripe. Now, for those who aren't familiar with this somewhat famous Twitter thread, there's a link and a QR code up there that you can follow and have a read afterwards. But this is a series of posts by Rebecca Murphy, who at the time was an engineering manager at Stripe. And she starts off by saying that her team, the developer experience team, started in January 2022 with 2 things: the SPACE paper and the vague idea that they would make it really, really easy for engineers to complain about things. What they did is they called the complaints submitted by engineers paper cuts, and they created cute little buttons that they stuck all over their tools to make it really easy to submit them. Turns out the buttons got clicked, and they got clicked a lot. And further down the thread, she says this: "We quickly realized just how many blind spots we had into the lived experience of software engineers." And that quote is something that sticks with me, because at the end of the day, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the intersection of the data that we collect, but then the information that the teams can use to enrich that and provide a better picture to us. So inspired by this, how did we start setting things up at Qoria to measure our own engineering experience? Well, to begin with, one thing that we used to do is we ran Westrum organizational culture surveys, really simple surveys, 5 questions, based on the research of a guy called Dr. Ron Westrum. And really what they tell you is, it speaks to the culture of your organization. Are you a very top-down driven organization, quite authoritarian, failure is not really tolerated, those sorts of things? Or are you more generative? Are you accepting a failure as long as it's followed by inquiry? Do you not shoot messengers when they produce bad news? And that was a good start, but reading the Stripe stuff, I wanted to understand these paper cuts as well. So I moved out of Google Forms, which was fine for the small surveys, and the people team let us use CultureAmp, and we sent out another survey, our first proper engineering experience survey. And in this, we repeated the Western questions, but we also gave people a chance to submit paper cuts. Free-form text field, tell us what's going on, tell us your points of friction in your day-to-day work. And we also started to measure cognitive load, so getting an idea of how much stress teams were under or how overloaded they felt. I supplemented this with interviews with our leaders or principal engineers to get an idea of what was going on in their team. But fundamentally, a thing that was missing was gathering all this data together was really, really hard. Lots of free-form text, trying to draw stuff out of these survey responses, even in a survey tool like CultureAmp, it's getting a bit difficult. I needed something that I could really send out to like 130 odd people and understand what was going on. That's when I came across a product called DX, or rather a company called DX and their experience product. And this is pretty much what we're using right now. Now, straight away, there's 3 pieces of context that I can highlight here. So at the top, we've got some really high-level questions that get asked. So they're just like, how productive do you feel in day-to-day work? How engaged are you when you come into work? Those sorts of things. But then we start drilling into things that are really specific about your day-to-day experience in your team. So what are the quality of your requirements like? How easy is it for you to ship stuff to production? And we ask people 2 things. We ask them, how do you feel about this? Like, what's your sentiment? Is it good? Is it bad? That kind of thing. And then, how important is this to you to improve? And that's interesting because surely you'd want to improve all the worst things, right? Well, as it turns out, no. A lot of the time, importance and sentiment don't necessarily correlate, and teams want to continue improving things that are already pretty okay. But they're telling you that those are the most important things to improve, right? So improve them. The other thing that we've got over here is some commentary. So people can leave a response and say, this is what we should do, or we've got this problem. And then others can reply to that, or +1 it, or offer solutions that have worked from their own areas. And all of this builds up to a really, really rich experience of what's going on within these teams. Now, this talk isn't about this product, and you don't need this product to do this. At the end of the day, though, what it is about providing that context and those insights that come from the trenches, so to speak, and combining that with the data that you're gathering systematically across the board. You're probably measuring something like DORA already, or maybe you're tracking things like, how stable the velocity of your teams are, or things like that. That's all great. The data is great. You should keep doing that. But supplementing it with context is how you get the much better picture of what's going on. And that's what enables you to solve problems. Now, when we're talking about solving problems, the first thing that you need to understand is not all problems are created equal. So problems for an individual in a team, crappy local environment, not having a learning and development plan, untrained on a particular tool that they're using. These are things that the individual can fix, or someone in the team can help them with, or maybe their manager. But then team level problems are a bit tougher. Like maybe you've got cultural problems within your team, or maybe you've got process or organizational problems. Maybe your devs are just sort of chucking stuff over the fence to your QAs and saying, there you go, that's your job, I'm on to the next thing. Maybe you've got really painful collaboration between teams within your organization. Or maybe you've got really, lacking sort of documentation standards. So when things like onboarding occur, new person joins the team, they can't get set up effectively. That's not just a problem for them, that's a problem for your team, because your team is going to spend weeks getting them up to speed. And then finally, we've got the systemic problems, the things that are much, much bigger. Big cultural problems in an org, or organizational structural problems. Development is over here, operations is over there, never the twain shall they meet, there's a lot of waste in the middle. Or maybe you've got the world's worst ticketing system. Everyone in this room has a system in their mind right now. It's all right, we don't need to share what that is, you're right. When you focus on the big stuff, that's how you start making big grounds. So A lot of what I do is sort of thinking about these problems as a force multiplier for the engineering team. So for instance, the past couple of quarters I've spent looking at Qoria rather, I have spent looking at our product development lifecycle. So this is it's probably one of the biggest processes within Qoria in terms of its reach. There is almost not a team in the company that this does not touch, either as a stakeholder or a participant. And that can be really daunting, right? Like that's a huge process, and trying to improve that seems like a gigantic job. But it's also a massive opportunity. If you can take this process that spans teams and teams and teams, and you can improve it by just like 10%, you're not improving that for like one person or one team. You're improving that for like hundreds of people. And that's a huge opportunity. Now, if you've got a background in lean thinking, it definitely helps. There's a lot of mapping of processes, a lot of looking into data and turnaround times and things like that, identifying waste and poorly implemented processes. But if we go back to an earlier point, there's also a people element to this. It's not just the numbers, it's what the teams are telling us. And so bringing those worlds together and trying to coalesce a picture of where the next best improvement is really important. Some of the stuff that you've got to do to effectively do this is educate, leverage, and help some of the leaders within your organization, whether they're within technology or without. Maybe the next biggest thing that you can do to help your engineering team isn't actually within engineering itself. Maybe it sits with your security team or your HR team or your product team. Building relationships and working with these people to understand how they can solve the bigger picture is really important. But no less important are the working groups or communities that already exist within your organization. Pretty much everywhere I've worked has had a great community at a grassroots level of developers or testers or engineers or whatever. For years when I worked at Bank West, we had a developer community that I helped run and organize, and it was great. Year after year after year, there was great content. People would give talks, they'd go on to conferences, we'd talk about new ideas, all sorts of things. We do similar things at Qoria now. We have, global Qoria learning sessions. Someone from the UK was trying to teach me about neural networks the other month. I think some of it got through. But the reality is, these communities are great places to look for experience improvements because they've got problems that they want to solve. They've got ideas. They're a collection of really smart people. If you leverage them, you can start solving these problems. But when you're focusing on all the big stuff, it's also really important to not forget the small wins that can be made along the way. So anyone who works with me knows that I harp on about retrospectives way too much, but honestly, they are the single most important ceremony any team can have, whether they're agile or not. And I'm right, fight me, etc. It's, at the end of the day, they are the engine of continuous improvement for your team, if you get them right. If. At some point, anyone who's in this room who's worked in an agile team has sat through a really sucky retrospective, and they suck the air out of the room and the energy of the team, and you don't want that. But if you get them right, and you start driving improvements on a regular basis, your experience gets better. The other thing is, for someone like me, individual teams can be like canaries in the coal mine. So I can have a look at a team, I can have a look at issues that they're having with their build pipelines or whatever it might be, and I can use that as an indicator of whether that's going to be an issue elsewhere. Equally, if they've tried a new tool and it's going really well, that's something that we can spread out to the rest of the organization potentially. And those teams can then become champions of that. So this can be like little quality of life improvements at the end of the day. Something really simple like, reducing the build time of, whatever JavaScript packaging engine you're using, or bringing in a new tool to do automated QA testing to dramatically cut down the time that it takes to run your smoke tests. Whether it's tooling or process or practice, these teams can help build in these little tweaks that can flow out across your organization. It's a snowball effect. One team makes a positive change. The teams adjacent who are working with that team see that and go, why don't we have that? And then they implement it, And then the teams working with them implement it, and before you know it, you've got this wave of improvement that sweeps across your organization, in theory. Now, how you can support that, either as an individual engineer or as a leader within your team, is helping to spread the word and, talk. Could be at a conference like this or a meetup. My colleague here, Todd, talking here last year. Could be internal blog posts or, meeting groups or whatever you've got. Could be hackathons. We run a global hackathon every year. Some of the stuff that we produce goes into our products soon after, or some of the stuff just goes into our QA environments or test environments to make working easier. Someone one year, at some point, just a really simple thing, like we used to have a mobile app and it had 3 different environments, and you have to go through this dance to use 3 different builds to test those different environments. And someone in a hackathon was just like, hey, so what if we did this thing and you shaked your phone and a prompt came up and it asked you which environment you wanted to do? Yeah, that's a pretty cool idea. That was in use 2 weeks later. And it just made, all the QAs in that team were like, this is fantastic. And it doesn't even have to be a big event, right? So my colleague Sandro down the bottom here, just a simple Slack message that he posted, and one day he was like, you know what, here's this infrastructure as code PR that just adds Jira issue linking to your GitHub repositories and just does it for you. Little quality of life thing, no biggie. You wouldn't really think was particularly exciting, but then you saw all the little love hearts appearing. Oh, this seems to be important to people. And then you saw all the GitHub pull requests for people making the exact same change for their repositories across the organization started to come in as well. It's like, okay, maybe this is something that we actually just need across the board. And all from, I don't know, a Slack message that probably took him 20 seconds to type. So solving problems is great. It's what we want to do. And we want to improve the experience for our people. But for me, how we went about setting this up and how you go about making it successful doesn't come without challenges. A good example here is the learning and development side of things. So when my boss and I sat down at the start, as I mentioned, one of our aims was to improve L&D for people and drive that within the organization. And to start with, we got those runs on the board. We established organizational policy support with our people team for some generous learning and development budgets for our people. We created a tech learning and development hub on our internal wiki where we listed conferences like this, meetup groups in Perth, Melbourne, Leeds, wherever our teams were based. We linked into training providers and platforms, a Cloud Guru, Pluralsight, Coursera, all these things. And we took our lunch and learns that we were running sort of locally in our offices and we made them a global event. So, people try to teach me about neural nets from the other side of the world. And this all worked. This all worked really well. And we ran our people and culture survey afterwards and we saw a 25-point engagement score increase in learning and development across the technology team. Great, this is fantastic. This is really, really easy. Except, I'd created a role, but I hadn't created a budget, didn't have a team, didn't have a line of business. I was spending other people's money, and that's fine to a point, but then it gets to a point where you're not just making new wiki pages and you want to do something else, and well, you have to convince people, right? It's their money, fair enough. And part of the challenge here is, especially when you don't, back before we had our sort of tooling set up to get opinions from people and sort of insights from our teams, what was obvious to me as someone who had worked in these teams wasn't so obvious to people who were towards the top of the tree in the organization and, handed out money. And so there's a challenge there, right? So there's a lot of education that goes on. There's a lot of working with these people and trying to gather evidence, which if you don't have the right tooling is hard, putting that together and bringing it to the table. And this meant things took a long time. So pitching ideas was really easy. Everyone's always happy to hear a new idea. Resourcing them, a bit harder. because now you've got to pony up some cash and buy something or change something or interrupt the delivery of something to make a change. And delivering that becomes even harder. And fair enough, like, these people have got a lot of different things on their plate and you're competing for time. And then obviously there was the challenge of how could I get information from like 150 different people and coalesce that into one spot. Now, as it turned out, once I solved that problem, once I got the right tooling in place to do that, all of the problems before it became a lot easier and became a lot more simplified because you could point to not only the data, but also what people were telling you and say, yeah, this is actually something that we should look at. But the final problem is probably a little bit more of a personal problem, right? And that's bias. Now, at the end of the day, something like the L&D hub, I shipped it, I produced some measurements for it. We ship a product, we should measure it. You could measure engagement, and it was going pretty well. Except I felt it should be better. And I was like, well, what is wrong with this? Like, why isn't this thing falling over? There's a lot of good material in there. And at the end of the day, there's nothing wrong with it, right? It's just my personal bias. I'm a very learning-driven person. Like, that's where my bias is at. And that's not true of all people. And I was letting that influence my expectations of what should be coming out there. So checking those biases and thinking about them before we roll out the next piece of work became really important. As did learning to sell. So I'm an engineer at heart. I can sell you on why a piece of work is going to need to take 2 weeks rather than 2 days. I can negotiate short-term, compromises with long-term goals. Lobbying for this sort of work in the experience world is very similar, but you've just got a much higher level audience. And they're not always technology people as well. You're having to work with the head of HR, or you're having to work with finance to try and get some of that budget that you're talking about. And this meant not only trying to educate those people as to why things that I saw was important for them as well, but as I mentioned before, competing with other really important people within the organization who had equally important things to try and deliver. Now, to break through that, the moment I actually sat down and worked out a way of succinctly describing what I was delivering for the organization and what I hoped to deliver next, and most importantly, how that mapped up to the organization's overall goals, like, that made the biggest difference working with these people. Being able to speak in terms of, like, you've got a goal of building a world-class engineering team with engagement of blah, I can help you with that. The other thing that helped me with is, at a personal level, it helps you roll with the punches, right? Like, pitching idea after idea after idea and getting, like, rejected because, it isn't quite good enough or it doesn't meet the criteria that they want. Reframing that instead as, like, a changing of customer needs. Again, I'm an engineer, like, change is constant. Ship this, customer didn't want that, we want this instead. Okay, I can deal with that. I'm able to adapt to that, and I should be thinking about that the same way here as well. Now, this quote here from Min Pham from Ibotta, Engineering Enablement Podcast, fantastic resource. I mentioned it at the end. But they're talking about running a developer experience team at Ibotta, and they say, we're talking about what the goalpost is every single month. We use this metaphor in thinking about the developer experience team, that everything that we're trying to build. We are a startup within a startup. And that is that was one of those sort of light bulb moments for me where I'm like, okay, this isn't just about shipping something, celebrating it, and spending a bit of time watching it and monitoring it and sort of waiting until the next big thing comes along a while later. No, you've shipped it, there is another problem or 3 or 4 or 5 right behind it. And once you get into that sort of realization and you're happy to sort of work through that and able to kind of establish a good cadence with it, there's a lot more comfort that comes along with that. And so really where that led me to is mastering these sort of conversations with our stakeholders in the organization and sort of saying, okay, here's what you've got for your money so far. Here's how it's helped you achieve your goals. This is what that same level of investment will get you next. Here's what I can offer. But with this increasing level of investment, I could actually give you this. And so that's kind of how I started to roll that conversation, get more and more achieved, essentially, as the years went on. Now, before I finish, I mentioned a few really key resources here in working with what is a wildly named field of work. Whether you call it engineering experience like I do, developer experience, developer productivity, there is a wealth of resources out there. Some really good ones that I would point you to if you're interested in this space. So the Engineering Enablement Podcast, I mentioned it before, there is a series of really interesting different leaders, backgrounds, company sizes that participate in that podcast. The episodes that are on the space paper and Dora Metrics talking to Dr. Forsgren and Dr. Story are really good themselves. I would highly recommend having a look at the space paper. It's pretty easy reading, much like Accelerate, and it's not on here, but you should totally read the Phoenix Project if you haven't already. These are all really, really good resources at understanding what it takes to not only measure things within software delivery, but understand the wider context that they sit within. In terms of me, you can see me on that website that shall not be named. I'll just be probably ranting about football and cricket until everything finally burns down and falls over. But that reaches the end of my talk. I hope it's been enlightening and you've learnt a few things on the way, and I think I've got time to answer a few questions if there are any.
Thanks, David. That was really informative. I wanted to latch on to your point about good retros, bad retros. What are some of the best attributes that you've seen? Obviously, it'll vary a bit from team and organisation, but what does good look like for you in a retro?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to start by naming another book. Agile Retrospectives by Esther Darby is a fantastic resource, but I would say number one would be everyone is engaged pretty much as soon as they walk in the room and in the first couple of minutes. If everyone has been able to talk and have a conversation in that first initial period, chances are that they're willing to contribute for the rest of the meeting. The other thing is, and it's probably more something to avoid rather than what makes it good, but I think often, particularly at the start of teams' life cycles, there's a tendency to want to solve the world in terms of your retro actions and stuff. And so you'll often see okay, we're going to take away these 10 actions and 2 for you and 2 for you and 1 for you and 3 for you. Don't do that. Hopefully your team is going to be together a long time. You're going to be able to focus on these things over a period of time. Pick 1 or 2 things, focus on them, make them a little bit better, come back in 2 weeks, a month, whatever it is that you run in terms of your cadence. See if you want to keep working on them or, change target to something else. I think those are the main things that stand out. I mean, there's a lot you can do, but if you get those 2 right, you're pretty much on the right track.
David, wanted to ask a question. So I'm wondering about the assumption or the premise that developer productivity is really closely related to kind of happiness, right? And that developers are really peculiar. As an engineer, I get that. As a former team lead, I get that. We have different things that make us happy than lots of other people. How did you go, I guess, explaining some of that to people in HR and other places that may not kind of understand how that actually will work?
Yeah. Well, I'm really lucky. At Courier, our people team has got some really good people in it, and it's really easy to have not just sort of constructive conversations with them about this stuff, but somewhat direct and honest conversations as well. So I think if you've got that level of understanding to begin with, that really helps. Both parties start from a place of not thinking that they know everything about engagement and happiness and stuff within orgs. I think, the people aspect, yes, I hear it a lot, developers in particular or engineers as a whole, we're very different people. And we are, but it's kind of like that saying that like everyone is their own like special, unique snowflake, just like everyone else. I think a lot of the things that we see with engineering teams are not necessarily just isolated to engineering teams. You know, lots of teams, regardless of whether they are in the organization, you know, might have someone who's got some pretty bad behaviors or might struggle to communicate effectively, or you know, things like that. So I think a lot of the time it's just talking at a level which is pretty fundamental to a lot of what these people do, which is, you know, staff engagement, staff well-being, things like that, and then illustrating how something that you want to do is a driver of that. Fundamentally, at the end of the day, the person who's in charge of the people team within your organization is probably incentivized to have, you know, X retention or whatever it is, or people and culture scores in sort of culture amp. What you're basically doing is you're discussing with them how they're going to achieve that in the context of your engineering teams. I think there's, yep.
When you're referring to retros, because obviously there's a few ways to do it, in a culture where meeting bloat is already a little bit of a problem, would you recommend going for smaller squads or the larger development team as a whole post-sprint?
Yeah, I was having this conversation with someone at work. So, as I said before, like we're quite big these days. We've probably got, I don't know, at a guess, certainly more than a dozen, maybe more than 15 engineering managers now. And we've got a lot of very different teams. We've got teams who work on like hardware appliances that are like racked into schools and, you know, have a release cadence of like a physical release cadence of like months. And then you've got people who are like, you know, whacking stuff into GCP hourly, you know. And they work in very different ways and at very different cadences. And I think at the end of the day, what you want to try and achieve with these retros is not look at them as a ceremony that you have to do at like a mandated level, but rather what you're trying to achieve is you're trying to achieve essentially coming together of people, talking about how we improve stuff, and then targeting those improvements. And you can do that like in a meeting room every 2 weeks, if that's your jam, or you can go to the pub, right? And have a beer and talk about things and do it that way. Or you can run a game and, you know, play Scribble or, you know, whatever game of your choice for half an hour, and then follow that up with a discussion about what you want to do. That fundamentally, the most important thing is, you know, what's going to work for the team rather than trying to like dictate something, and then let the team fit that into their own schedule. You know, the engineering manager I was speaking to was like, we don't really work in like a Scrum sort of way, so we can't really do retros. And it's like, all you need to do is get the team together like once a month for a chat about what they want to improve. And yeah, after the first thing, they were like, hey, there's like 30 GitHub repositories that we can get rid of. Like, yeah, see?
I think we've got enough time for one more question.
Thanks for the talk. My question was just around when you started to find there was a real pressing need for the developer or engineer experience platform.
So the platform itself that I was talking about that we bought, or just the sort of role or function as a whole? Yep. I think it's kind of hard to pinpoint a single point in time, but somewhere between where we had grown to a point where I, as a manager, had ended up with like 40 people reporting directly into me, and then us having like, I don't know, a dozen managers who were running like lines of business with their own sort of squads and teams, and all of a sudden, because we'd acquired other companies and stuff, people were working in like very different ways, and you could kind of just see from like interactions on like the chat tools or, you know, in meetings or whatever, that there was just a lot of like friction that really didn't sort of need to be there. And that, yeah, that's kind of the point where it was kind of like, okay, there isn't really a way to sort of solve this without somebody starting to like look across the whole picture and start to, you know, smooth some of those bumps out. So I think that was the main sort of driver.